Well, welcome back, my friends, to HS211, History of the Restoration Movement. In this module, we will be discussing the theological system known as Calvinism. Now, I guess we should start off with what historian Nathan Hatch has to say about this. He says that before the American Revolutionary War, the majority of professing Christians will call themselves Calvinists, meaning that they follow the theological system of Calvinism set out by John Calvin. But after the war, in the midst of the revival known as the Second Great Awakening, there will be a steady devaluation of Calvinism among American Christians. Some groups, like the Methodists and the advocates of the Restoration Movement, will attack Calvinism outright and instead prefer a theological system known as Arminianism instead. Other groups, such as the Presbyterians and the Baptists, will remain Calvinistic, but even then, their theology will shift into a considerably milder form of Calvinism, a form that allows for an evangelical impulse and agenda. In either case, the strict Calvinism of the early American settlers will nearly fade away after the American Revolution, and this lecture is dedicated to explaining how this process came about. So then, let us begin by talking about the founder of Calvinism, a man known as Jean Calvin, or John Calvin, as we English speakers tend to call him today. Calvin was born in northern France in 1509. Now, this date of 1509 is important because it means that Calvin's childhood and early education coincided with the first generation of Protestant reformers, such as Martin Luther and Ulrich Zwingli. And while these early reformers were charting new theological territory, Calvin was experiencing all of that as part of his formative education. So in short, Calvin grew up dialoguing and thinking about Reformation ideas as he received his education. And it is because of this that many historians consider Calvin a second-generation reformer. By the time Calvin is making an impact on the world stage of Protestant thought, many early reformers such as Zwingli are already dead, and some of the older reformers like Menno Simons and Martin Luther are fairly old news theologically. Now, Calvin's significant contribution to the Protestant effort will be the production of its first comprehensive systematic theology. This is a text known as the Institutes of the Christian Religion, or it's often just simply abbreviated as the Institutes. Now, unlike Luther, who was trained as a theologian, Calvin was trained to be a lawyer, and this tended to give him a keen eye for the organization of details and for the desire to produce a theological system that covered all the bases, that tried to answer as many questions, and tried to be logically consistent. Now, I should probably mention at this point that this systematic theology became a massive book, and a book that was not static. It was actually a book that morphed and changed over a 23-year period. And I point this out because the original 1536 edition is only 1/4 the size of the final 1559 edition. And what this tells me is that Calvin was always thinking and rethinking through his positions, and that it was never his point to have the final say in a theological matter, because any conclusion that Calvin came up to was always open for revision and reformulation. And if there's a takeaway point I want you to get from this, it's this, that Calvin's theology was always a work in progress. But many of Calvin's followers will often point back to this book as a systematic theology that is set in stone. And unfortunately, that's not even the way Calvin himself would have thought about his own work, that it was always a work in progress to be re-explored and re-examined at every point. So now, because Calvin's theology was preserved in a large and bulky set of books, many of his successors took very great pains to simplify his thought and make it more memorable. And one of the more important mnemonic devices for remembering Calvin's teaching on election, salvation, and anthropology is this acronym TULIP, TULIP. Now, Calvin sought to explain how the process of human salvation happens in light of the biblical claims that God is all-powerful and that nothing is beyond his control. And this, of course, sets up an issue with the problem of evil. How can evil exist if God is A, 100% good, and B, in complete control of everything? Well, this is why Calvin's system starts off with the doctrine of anthropology, the doctrine of humanity. And he asserts that every human being is born totally depraved. This is the T in the TULIP acronym. Simply put, total depravity means that all humans are born 100% evil, and each and every one of them deserves to go to hell simply for being born with an evil heart. Now, most theologians also note that total depravity is the linchpin of Calvin's entire argument. If you remove total depravity, the rest of the argument falls flat. And anyone wishing to reject Calvin's system has had to begin by asserting that humanity may be damaged by sin, but that humans are not born completely evil. Now, continuing on, Calvin's system focuses on how God saves such miserable and wretched human beings. And here Calvin asserts that God unconditionally elects anyone he has chosen to save. And this means that the humans have no choice in this matter, as salvation depends solely on God's eternal decree. Now, the next logical point in this matrix is the understanding of limited atonement. After all, if God is only intending to save the elect, then the atoning sacrifice of Jesus must not apply to everybody, but only to a limited number of people. Otherwise, all people would be saved by Christ's blood, regardless of what they believe. So next, Calvin logically concluded that the elect people must make a transition between being totally depraved and becoming utterly redeemed. And at some time during their life, they experience a moment what could be called irresistible grace. Like unconditional election, irresistible grace cannot be obtained through human effort, and a person must wait on God to perform this circumcision of the heart, transitioning them from totally depraved to a recipient of grace. And the last item on this list follows logically from the previous points. If a human being has no say in their election, or they have no say in the moment when they will be receiving grace, once they are saved, they cannot back out of God's covenant. And this leads to a doctrine known as the perseverance of the saints, that a saved Christian will always remain in a state of grace and in a state of salvation. And notice that this process begins and ends with God making human salvation happen, and that human beings in this process are merely passive objects, and that they do virtually nothing in order to receive their salvation. Now, it should be noted that Calvinism, like all theological systems, depends on what is called a regulatory principle. Simply put, a regulatory principle is a basic truth upon which all other truths are built. And for Calvin's system, as we have already seen, this regulatory principle is the sovereignty of God. For Calvin, God is 100% in complete control of his entire creation, and that includes total control over the fate of every human being who has ever lived. What this means with regards to human salvation is that even when it looks like a person is acting of their own free will, God is really controlling every factor that goes into that decision. So yes, even when a human being decides to repent and to seek God with all their heart, this is more a matter of God giving that person irresistible grace, and not an aspect of the person actually choosing anything for themselves. Now, notice what would happen if this regulatory principle was different. If Calvin had not stated and started out that God's sovereignty was the end-all be-all, but instead asserted that something like God's love or God's holiness was the basic truth on which all other truths are built. You see, for Calvin, his entire system is the logical conclusion of the understanding that God's power, also known as his omnipotence, is absolute, and that God could not limit this power even if he wanted to. Now, needless to say, other theologians after Calvin have disagreed that God's sovereignty is the necessary starting point, and as a result, they've come up to some radically different conclusions from Calvin. Now, where this is going to apply to us, for our study of the Restoration movement, it is necessary to point out that most of the early Restorationists, Thomas Campbell being the exception, all disagreed with Calvinism. They will read their Bibles and they will conclude that there is a different regulatory principle than the sovereignty of God which is at work. And because of this, they will start to develop a doctrine of human free will with regards to personal salvation. Now, don't misunderstand me. The idea of Christian free will has been around for centuries, long before the Protestant Reformation. The early advocates of the Restoration movement will not create this idea of Arminianism or human free will with regards to salvation. They will simply conclude that it is true and develop their writings and their beliefs accordingly. Since in the Calvinistic system, salvation depends upon God's sovereign choice, the question of how and when God makes this choice becomes quite important, I dare say paramount, in this equation. Calvin and his followers after him will assert that this choice is made eternally, that before God ever created the world and began the process by commanding, "Let there be light," that God chose every human being that he was ever going to save. This doctrine is known as God's absolute predestination, that before the foundation of the world, God made a choice, and this choice cannot be questioned, changed, or altered, even by God himself. In this way, Calvin asserted that God is unchanging and that his will is immutable. Again, another word for unchanging. This, of course, raises an interesting question. What if a person feels like they want to follow God, but are unsure if they were predestined to do so? Well, let me kind of explain that certainly in the American frontier and in other Calvinistic areas, many Christians throughout the ages will be driven to despair and madness because of this doctrine. They will feel like they want to follow God, but they will not have significant proof that God has elected them. And the result will often be mental anguish as they are waiting and praying for God's irresistible grace and wondering, did I receive it? Was that it? Or was that it? Could that be it? And interestingly, in a doctrine like Calvinism that is promoting the perseverance of the saints, assurance of salvation will often be very hard to come by in these early years. Now, a second aspect of Calvin's doctrine I want to discuss is that his predestination is viewed as a particular predestination. And that means that it pertains to individuals and not to groups. And for this reason, Calvin and most of the Protestants who followed him theologically will place a great amount of emphasis on individual salvation and the conversion stories that go with them. And there will be a growing expectation that, at least in Calvinistic circles, that when a person has experienced irresistible grace, they will also have a testimony that will show that God has elected them. Now, the problem with this is that most of these testimonies will be entirely subjective. No one will be going around saying that they heard God's voice from heaven saying something like, "Behold, my child, you are now receiving irresistible grace." No, usually these stories will involve some kind of a life-threatening situation. For example, Alexander Campbell will come close to dying in a bad storm while he's trying to sail across the Atlantic, and he will take this as proof that he should be a preacher. Likewise, Elias Smith will be pinned down by a falling tree in the middle of a snowstorm, and he will take this as a sign that God has elected him. But notice that these events are not concrete signs from God in any way, shape, or form, and that to interpret these signs as a proof of irresistible grace requires a certain amount of personal conceit there, doesn't it? And how this will play out in the local churches is often leaders of these churches will have to listen to testimonies, and then they will have to vote on whether they believe the person has received a real sign of irresistible grace or not. And for some groups, such as Presbyterians, this process will involve a theological test. And this will require that a person not only have a saving experience, but will also need to have a degree of literacy and even theological training in order to be considered a Christian. Now, a final aspect of Calvin's doctrine of predestination that we need to discuss is this idea that his predestination is double. That God has chosen both the people that he will save, just as he has chosen the people who he will damn. Now, this aspect of Calvinism has historically not set well with people who are generally okay with the idea of God choosing to save people, but will have difficulties with the notion of God choosing who to condemn. And many softer versions of Calvinism that we'll see developing on the frontier will explicitly go out of their way to call it single predestination, that he has chosen who he will save, but he has not chosen who he will condemn. Well, as Calvin noted, unfortunately, it is only logical for God's predestination to be double, that it is impossible for him to single out a group for salvation, and to not also single out the other group for damnation. That this is the logical conclusion of a doctrine where there's only two choices. You are either saved or you're lost. If you make a choice that some people will be saved, you obviously have also chosen that the rest will be lost. Now, Calvin stipulated that God does this particularly to display his power and his sovereignty. For the saved, this choice shows that God is merciful, choosing to forgive some so that he may receive praise, honor, and mercy. But for the lost, a group of people that Calvin will often call the reprobate, God's choice displays his justice, that these are human beings with evil hearts and have corresponding evil actions. And, as Romans chapter 3 says, the wages of sin are death. And so God must therefore execute his judgment and his vengeance if justice is to prevail. So, needless to say, these three ideas of absolute predestination, particular predestination, and double predestination will go very much against the frontier mindset of the American settlers. Got to remember, these are some fairly rough and tumble people. They're making a living on their own, and they will come to understand that their decisions are important, and that their own opinions matter. And because of this, many on the frontier will come to reject Calvinism, or they will have to modify it so that it matches the frontier experience, which is that human free will choice, even in matters of religion, are a reality and must be taken into consideration. Now, for our study of the Restoration Movement and churches in America in general, it will be necessary to discuss Calvin's ideas of the church and the government. Now, when Calvin came to the city of Geneva, he virtually assumed control over the city in order to institute all of his reforms. Now, he didn't just seize power or lead a military coup. The city government of Geneva gladly gave him power because they wanted to see reform in their city. And throughout Calvin's lifetime, the city of Geneva would be turned into a virtual theocracy, where the church leaders and teachers would rule over every aspect of city life. And it will be under these kind of circumstances that we will be introduced to a fairly nasty theological conundrum. You see, according to Calvin's theology, not everyone who calls himself a Christian is elect. And so, if the church is in control of the government, and we have these totally depraved people who are intermingled in with the elect, then Calvin saw that there's a necessity for the church to police all of these depraved people so long as they fall under the church's jurisdiction. And what this will mean is that during Calvin's tenure, there will be quite a number of exiles, there will be a few executions, and trials for heresy. And many of the other reformers that will take a shine to Calvin's ecclesiology or doctrine of the church will try to do the same in their own context. And while we could look at a number of them, let's look at the Puritans from Massachusetts, for example, as they became somewhat infamous for their heresy exiles. For example, Rogers, the founder of Rhode Island, leaves Massachusetts because he is exiled for his beliefs. And also the witch trials that happened in Massachusetts are also fairly well known today. And all of this I'd like to point out is that when the church assumes control and sees it as their job to police the depraved people, it will create quite a lot of fear, it will create quite a lot of tension, and as the budding American government, armed with Jefferson's interpretation that there should be a separation of church and state, when this thing gets rolling, that ideas of the church controlling the government will fall into very negative light. And people will often point out times like when Geneva was controlled by Calvin or Massachusetts was controlled by the Puritans to show that it was actually a very bad thing for the church to be in control of people. Alright, so that's the basic overview of the life and teachings of John Calvin. Now, I should probably conclude here that Calvin will have many disciples that will be left behind in the wake of his death, and many of them will see it as their job to continue the work that Calvin started. And so it is important to note that just as Calvin's theology changed and morphed during his lifetime, the people who came after him, his spiritual successors, if you will also add to his ideas and will create a somewhat ironic reality for us today that only about 80% of the major doctrines of Calvinism as we know it today were actually ideas first formulated by Calvin himself. And just on a personal note, I do tend to find this funny, as most of the times when I'm having discussions with Calvinists, they will often assume that the doctrines came kind of purely straight from Calvin's mind to where they are today. And quite frankly, this is a misunderstanding of how theology works, that it is always in a sense of flux, and it's always developing. And so, for the next couple of slides, we will be discussing some of the major changes that happened to the doctrines of Calvinism after John Calvin's death in 1564. And specifically, we'll be looking at the doctrines that tended to be unpopular on the American frontier and eventually generated a backlash of which people in the Restoration movement will certainly associate with that backlash. So, now that we've had that quick and dirty 20-minute crash course on John Calvin, let's look quickly at how Calvin's ideas changed at the hands of other theologians living after him. Probably the most important individual we need to look at is Calvin's friend and successor as Reformer of Geneva, a man named Theodore Beza. Now, Beza outlived Calvin by 41 years, and as a result, he had ample time to codify Calvin's ideas into even more systematically than Calvin had. And many commentators, such as historian David Steinmetz, note that under Beza's theological influence, the subject of predestination became, as he calls it, the nerve center of Calvinism. Now, this is not to say that Calvin did not consider the doctrine important. After all, Calvin did expand this section of his systematic theology to quadruple its original length in the 23 years that he had to toy with the idea. But Beza, in his writings, will magnify the importance even more. So much so that a solid declaration of the doctrine of predestination would often become necessary before a person could be considered orthodox or even reformed. And this can be seen today where many Calvinistic theologians and preachers will use a wide variety of verbal taunts and jeers against people who don't believe in predestination. For these kinds of people, often the best of them will assert that such people are just horribly misreading scriptures, while some of the worst of them will even claim that, if you don't believe in predestination, you are totally disqualified from being a Christian believer at all. So, in addition to making this doctrine of predestination a Christian essential, Beza will also introduce a new theological term into the mix called superlapsarianism. And this is a doctrine that Beza clearly articulated, that it is God's decision to predestine human beings, basically to commit them to an existence of total depravity, and that this choice is made before the creation of the world, i.e. the word super, before, lapse, the fall of mankind. So superlapsarianism. And ultimately, this doctrine, as it was articulated by Theodore Beza, under this understanding, it made God the author and the creator of evil, as well as the creator of good. And throughout the centuries, many have chafed at this understanding, since it clearly puts God in what could only be called a negative light. And the result is that many have often rejected superlapsarianism and choosing to believe that the fall happened by itself or through Adam's free choice, and then afterward, God's sovereign choice is made. So now let's shift gears here and talk a little bit about the history of Calvinism and how that set of doctrines, which started out in France and Switzerland, how they made their way to England and eventually to the Americas, where our study is largely focused. And the simple explanation for how this travel happened is known as the Marian exile of the Church. During the reign of Mary I, Queen of England, many Protestants were persecuted because Mary was Catholic and she was trying to reinstitute Catholicism in England. And so these persecuted Protestants will flee to the city of Geneva. And the most important theologian for our study who will make this flight is a Scottish reformer known as John Knox. Now, once Knox gets to Geneva, he's going to be absolutely blown away, both by Calvin's doctrine and the type of control that Calvin has over the city of Geneva itself. He'll even go so far as to call Calvin's theocratic government the most perfect school of Christ on earth. Now, he'll learn very well from Calvin, and so when Mary dies in 1558, Knox and many of these other reformers will return back to England and Scotland, and they'll bring Calvinism with them. And because of the work of Knox and these other English Calvinists, we'll start to see the development of a group of Christians in Great Britain and the Americas known as the Puritans. And these Puritans will work very hard at reforming both the Church of England and the Church of Scotland. Some of the more radicals at least, will come to places like New England and Massachusetts and form what are known as Congregationalist churches there. And as part of this reform that's at least interesting to me is that we start to see the raising of a question. How can we tell if a person has been predestined to be saved? And specifically, how can the church identify, yes, this person is elect, or this person isn't? Well, John Knox, as a theologian, will formulate we'll call it a litmus test, that supposedly had two outward signs of a true Christian. The first sign, he suggested, is moral regeneration. That a believer who has been elected by God will, once they've experienced this irresistible grace, exhibit an internal cleansing of the heart. They will no longer be acting like a totally depraved person, and this will manifest in righteous actions, righteous thoughts, and righteous behaviors. Now, the second sign that Knox suggested they will have is that the believer will have a salvation experience, and that this testimony will be able to demonstrate both to them and to others listening to it that God has indeed chosen them. Now, needless to say, both of these litmus tests are highly subjective. And many of the Calvinistic Puritans, both in Scotland and Massachusetts, will become rather notorious for setting the bar for Christianity very high. And even today, if you call a person's morals or their religion puritanical, it's meant to be an insult. And the reason for this is that there's this backlash that will develop against the high standards of morality and the control over politics and civil life that often happen in a Calvinistic paradigm. So, while the Puritans are going to be rather popular during the late 1500s and early 1600s, by the 1700s, particularly in the British colonies, Puritans and their Calvinism will begin to stagnate. The theology that was organized by Knox and Beza will seem very stifling because, well, quite frankly, in this kind of a paradigm, there's little reason for a person to evangelize for Christ. According to Calvinism, a person cannot repent until God gives them irresistible grace. And this will give people outside of the circle of faith little incentive to cultivate religion on their own. And it will give people within the circle of faith little reason to go out and evangelize. Why should I, if we're simply waiting on God to do that work? And because of this, Calvinistic theologians by the 1700s, particularly men like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, will start to rethink Calvinism, and a softer form of Calvinism will start to take hold. And the reason, and just to give a couple examples of this softening, for example, the doctrine of superlapse Arianism is going to fold up and largely vanish. Another idea of covenant theology, that a person has to be descended from a Christian, a saved Christian, in order to have a salvation experience himself, this kind of idea is also going to go by the wayside. And what's going to take its place is going to be a greater emphasis on preaching and evangelism. Now, Edwards is going to call this theology the new measures, and they're going to be very successful during a great revival that happened between 1740 and 1770. This revival is known as the First Great Awakening. And the take-home point I'd like for you to get from all of that is that strict Calvinism will, before the American Revolution, cease to be popular. And if Calvinism is going to survive, it's going to have to theologically morph and take on certain aspects of taking ideas of free will seriously. And in particular, with regards to free will, two of Edwards's main tenets of his new measures is that, first, there should be an appeal that a person should make a decision for Christ. And that when you appeal to a person, you should appeal not just to their intellect, but also to their emotions. And because of this, revivals during the First Great Awakening will set a trend that will become an expectation throughout evangelical Christianity. For example, today, it is commonplace for a sermon to target the unbelievers in the audience. This whole practice really got started with Edwards and his new measures, that preaching should appeal to the non-believers in our midst, instead of preaching to the Christians who need growth and edification. And this will manifest in many, many ways. For example, the idea of the altar call at the end of the service will start to develop, and people will be encouraged to act. They'll be told, if you feel God pulling on you, come down up front and pray. Earnestly pray for this conversion experience, and maybe God will give you that irresistible grace. Now, because Knox had already formulated this litmus test that the elect will have this experiential testimony, Edwards' new measures really focused on this idea, and the preaching started to be geared towards helping people have just such an experience when they came to church. So now, as we noted earlier, these new measures produced a spectacular revival in the years before the American Revolution. This is known as the First Great Awakening. And possibly the greatest preacher during this time was known as the divine dramaticist. His name was George Whitefield. And Whitefield will cross the Atlantic Ocean about 7 times. He'll come to North America, then he'll go back and preach in Britain, and he'll go back and forth pretty much for about a 15-year period. And Whitefield will gain a reputation as a very dramatic and lively preacher. And hundreds of people are going to get converted every time he preaches. And I should probably note that Whitefield is not originally trained as a theologian. He's originally trained to be an actor. And he will become known for his ability to perform biblical characters. And then when he would preach in a way that appealed to the emotions. And this entire program epitomized Edwards' new measures theology, that preaching should appeal to the unbeliever, and that it should appeal to the emotions as well as to the intellect. And probably the most lasting result of Whitefield's methods was that it created new expectations for preachers. After Whitefield, preachers were largely expected to have a certain amount of panache or flair, and their sermons had to be more than just a dry theological treatise. This expectation will carry over all the way into the revivals of the Second Great Awakening, and many of the pioneers of the Restoration movement will even dabble in this sort of preaching. But it won't be 100% across the board, and I would interestingly note that some of these early Restorationists will also acknowledge that there's a certain danger to appealing to the emotions and not necessarily appealing enough to the intellect. And so men like Alexander Campbell will become known not so much for flamboyant preaching, but for their well-reasoned theological writings. And so all of this is to say that the reaction from the Restoration movement to Calvinism, and particularly to this new measures form of revivalism, is going to be complex. Most of the early advocates of the Restoration movement, for example, Elias Smith, Barton Stone, and Thomas and Alexander Campbell, they'll all come from a Calvinistic background, but it's notable that almost all of them will dismiss some or all of this theological heritage. For example, Elias Smith will be the most vocal about undermining the whole Calvinistic system, while people like Thomas Campbell will take a lot of New Measures ideas with him, and even later in his life would still claim to be a Calvinist. So now, let's go ahead and sum up some of the pros and cons of the doctrine of Calvinism, and specifically what pros and cons they offered to Christians during the early days of the American Republic. Well, the first thing I'd like to note is that possibly the greatest advantage to Calvin's system was that it was logically consistent. Now, I'm not arguing. Some people disagree with it. I even disagree with it for the most part. But those who bought into Calvin's system took a great deal of comfort in the fact that it was very, very well thought out. And as a system, it did not contradict itself. It was logically consistent. Now, secondly, addition to all this, the system placed Protestant theology on the same level as Roman Catholic theology. They finally had a well-organized systematic theology that answered all of the major questions of life. It was an authoritative document that Christians could turn to when they were having difficulty rationally and reasoning through the scriptures. And it also offered convenient rebuttals to medieval Roman Catholicism at virtually every point. And lastly, don't misevaluate the strength that Calvin was able to achieve by making Geneva a Christian state run by the church. That this will become a ideal for many in this country, that Christians should be in control of both Christians and non-Christians, able to dictate their morality, able to write their laws, and able to enforce Christian ethics on the world. Now, with all these potential positives being said, there's going to be a few negatives that are going to come about, and by the time of the American Revolution, they're going to be glaringly obvious to most Christians. And for starters, Calvin's doctrines of predestination simply will not mesh with the private experience of most Americans. Frontier life and democratic government will convince most of these American settlers that their free will choice it not only exists, but it's extremely important. And adding to that, because predestination figured so prominently in Calvin's teachings, many of the early settlers of the British colonies had no real reason to evangelize, but as Calvinistic Christianity starts growing and starts learning from their decline in the 1600s, many of these preachers will say, all right, we've either got to soften this doctrine, or we have to preach with a certain amount of paradox, that we admit, that we've got to wait for irresistible grace to fall, but you know what? We're going to preach like they have a choice. And we see this largely today, that even strong Calvinists will preach like free will is a real and viable choice. And finally, many Americans will simply become fed up with what they perceive as the tyrannical rule of Calvinistic churches in America. And particularly, Puritanism will become something of a byword. And there's going to be this dramatic push, especially after Thomas Jefferson becomes president in 1800, to disestablish state churches so that they can minimize the control that the church could have over the government. So, here are my two major conclusions that I want you to walk away from this lesson on Calvinism. And the first is this, that a number of these Christians that are claiming to be Calvinistic will drop considerably after the American Revolution. Before the American Revolution, nearly 85% of people claiming to be Christian will also claim to be Calvinist. And this will be largely due to the evangelical efforts of people like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. But after the Revolution, all the way up until the time of the Civil War, that number is going to drop to about 50%, as non-Calvinistic groups, i.e. people that would call themselves Arminians, groups like the Methodists and many people within the Restoration movement, that they will win an unprecedented number of converts during the revivals of the Second Great Awakening. And secondly, I just want you to note that Calvinism will clash significantly with Mr. Jefferson's hermeneutic of self-evidence as he established in the Declaration of Independence. If I could put this simply, the experience of free will choice will seem to be self-evident to most Americans. And it will be very difficult for Christians to maintain a strongly Calvinistic bent without experiencing a certain amount of cognitive dissonance, i.e., their religion tells them God has chosen everything. My government tells me I have free will choice. And to quote various children's shows, one of these things is not like the other. And since most of these Americans will come to see themselves as masters of their own fate, both socially and politically, many of them will make a very easy transition to saying, well, that must also be true of my spiritual state, that I can choose whether or not to follow God of my own free will. And where this is going to apply to the Restoration movement is simply here, that most people in the Restoration movement will not be Calvinists, but they will come from a Calvinistic background. They will know a lot about what Calvin taught, and many of them will reject the way Calvin read the Bible. And this is going to be very important to our study because one of the things we're going to look at is how is it that very, very smart people reading the same text, this thing we call the Bible, come up to different interpretations. And so keep that in mind, that as these people are rejecting Calvinism in favor of a different interpretation, that it isn't a matter of they're reading the Bible and Calvin wasn't. It's more a matter of they're both reading the Bible but reading it differently. And for us in our study, one of our biggest questions we want to ask is, why does this happen? And so I would like to conclude with a comic from the webcomic Coffee with Jesus. In this one, we have a priest and Jesus having a nice little conversation over a morning cup of coffee. And the priest brings up this concern. He says, I've got a couple in my congregation, Jesus, who are separating due to, well, some infidelity. I.e., the preacher's upset because people in his congregation are getting divorced over sexual unfaithfulness. And Jesus basically chimes in as almost any conversational partner would. He says, yep, 30 minutes of pleasure followed by 30 years of complications, Joe. I've seen it 30 million times. And then Joe asked the question, couldn't we have stopped it? All of these damaged lives, it feels like such a waste. And Jesus' answer, in a very un-Calvinistic way, says this. In those situations, Joe, people tend to tune out the loudest warnings. And puppetry really isn't my thing. And so, as we conclude this discussion on Calvinism, this is going to be the basic question. If God is choosing everything, does that make us puppets? And if God isn't choosing anything, if we have a certain free will to choose God, to choose to worship God for ourselves, then why is it that God has not intervened more? Will become the theological conundrum. And so keep all these ideas in your mind, because as we go through looking at different people from the Restoration movement, they will all have their opinions of Calvinism. And some of them will be quite vocal about it. So watch how they respond. And as you do that, think through how you respond to this idea yourself. Thanks for your attention. Have a good day, and God bless you, my friends.